What Lurks Under the Bed by Gaetan, Battaglia.
1. The job would be simple. Rob the old Winston place. An elderly coot by the name of Eleanor Winston lived there alone. In a vault, hidden behind a rare painting, she kept mounds of jewelry, antique watches, and upwards of $200,000 in cash. Her husband had passed away a few years back, leaving her his entire estate and fortune. Her rent and other necessities were paid for by a magnificent trust. Based on that logic, the hoodlums justified their perpetration of the crime by arguing that she didn't need the treasures in the vault anyway. On the job would be 3 men: Jeremy Jeffries, Alan Bark, and Antonio Benito. Antonio had the inside scoop because he was Eleanor's estranged second cousin, hearing about her financial state of affairs through the familial grapevine. That information included the tidbit that she lived alone. Alan looked up her home address online, finding 3 listings under Winston, but only one headed with the initial E. He took that to mean Eleanor, jotting down the address. One last job remained, and it was the hardest part. They would need to secure some weapons. Nothing fancy, the group agreeing on handguns. For his part, Jeremy obtained the guns and ammo from a shady pawnshop owner who didn't care to ask questions as much as he was crooked. Antonio bought a blowtorch online for the occasion, shelling out what he considered to be a fortune, $20. That price bothered him so much that he had to cheer himself up by reassuring his parsimonious inklings that he would make a return on his investments many thousandfold, maybe snag some jewelry for his girlfriend or mother. Knowing the time and place that they would strike, the trio sat in wait for the right time to execute their nefarious plan. 2. Retirement treated Eleanor handsomely well. She wanted nothing. There were no material objects that she couldn't afford. Her monthly stipends for the trust were generous enough that she never needed to dip into the cash reservoir in the vault. During the day, she would go to the park, or take classes, or go for a walk to the library, anywhere she could be where she was around other people. At night, she sat in her rocking chair with her beloved cat Marmalade, a black cat with fur shinier and slicker than a flawless waxed car. When nestled on Eleanor's lap, the cat would purr a crackling purr that seemed endless. Marmalade's constant companionship made nights without her beloved Emmanuel much more bearable. She missed him dearly every day, wondering on occasion when she would be joining him. Relatives rarely called except to ask for money. Eleanor had enough resolve to send them packing. Lonely and well-off didn't mean she was her relative's personal piggy bank. Antonio hadn't been one to bother because he was normally too proud for handouts. When push came to shove, and given his deteriorating financial circumstances it did, he wasn't too proud to take the money by force. On the night that the trio decided to pull off the heist, Eleanor was sitting in her rocking chair with Marmalade, rubbing his ears as they listened to the radio. She had always preferred it to television, and especially to computers or the internet. Growing up in the era that she did had molded her liking in that way, she supposed. Lovely music played in her bedroom, tickling her ears. She lived in a brownstone that her husband originally bought several decades ago. Once full of their children, it was now full of empty rooms. Eleanor only used the kitchen to eat and do some light reading. Everything else was done in her room. Some parts of the brownstone accumulated thin films of dust from the years of underuse. Cobwebs had been erected all across the living room. At around 7 o'clock in the evening, the trio pulled in a small clunker of a car that was barely big enough to accommodate the 3 of them. Jeremy parked his car, killing the engine. There were streetlights shining down on the sidewalk way up the block. Voting on wearing masks, Antonio found himself outnumbered 2-1. Thus the trio went barefaced. Antonio only insisted on masks because he didn't want his second cousin to recognize him. Alan and Jeremy told him to relax when they outvoted him, saying that she wasn't going to live long enough to identify anybody. Scouring the streets for any pedestrians and coming up empty, Jeremy signaled for the other 2 to follow him out of the car. Alan assumed he had something to break down the door, or at least jimmy the lock. Jeremy had no such tool, opting to shoot the lock off the door instead. A loud blam ringing in their ears was followed up with Jimmy kicking the door open. The other 2 followed him inside, Antonio closing the door gently on his way in, as to not arouse the suspicion of neighbors or onlookers. All the brownstones' rooms were pitch black. The trio hadn't counted on this. Thinking on his feet, Alan took out his smartphone and used the flashlight feature to comb the darkness for a light switch. When he found one, he flicked the switch, prompting dozens of light bulbs to turn on simultaneously. Under the newly acquired lighting, the trio could see that there was a flight of carpeted stairs leading up to a second floor. Before the others could turn around, Jeremy was already jogging up the steps. Antonio and Alan took his lead. There were 6 rooms and a bathroom on this floor. This floor had a separate light switch from the bottom floor. That was an opportune stroke of luck because it made the outline of Eleanor's room stand out in the shadows. Her room was on the left, closest to the bathroom. The men walked down to the door, taking no careful steps. If Eleanor hadn't been able to hear them when the lock was shot clean off the front door, then she wasn't going to be able to hear them now. Jeremy twisted the doorknob, letting the door creak open. A shock of pearly white hair poked up from behind an antique rocking chair. Having trouble with her hearing, Eleanor hadn't noticed them come in, blissfully unaware of their presence. Jeremy rushed up to the rocking chair from behind, grabbing it and swinging Eleanor around. She opened her eyes, the ambience of her listening to music being cut short in the worst way possible.
What is... Antonio, what are you doing?
Eleanor asked, aghast.
This.
Jeremy answered succinctly, aiming his gun and shooting her between the eyes. Eleanor's brain splattered from the hole in her head, cast off settling in jagged splotches against her beloved rocking chair and all over the walls. Marmalade hissed, so spooked that he fled from Eleanor's lap and into the darkness. Alan raised his gun up to take the cat out before Jeremy waved him off.
What are you doing? It's a cat. Leave him alone. He can't testify against us anyways.
Jeremy reasoned, his soft side as an animal lover showing. Oh, right, Alan replied, ashamed of his lack of common sense. Antonio stepped forward with the blowtorch. Alan removed the painting from the wall. Depicted in the piece was a lovely sunset in forest, soiled with the now late Eleanor Winston's brain matter. Alan set it against a bookcase. Behind the painting was the vault, just as the trio had expected. Antonio hadn't any actual proof that it was going to be behind the painting, but nowhere else in the room would have made sense. And he assumed that, if anywhere, it would be in her room. Based on the occurred dust and cobwebs around the brownstone, it was evident that she hadn't gone in any other room since her dearly beloved Emmanuel had passed away. Forgetting to bring safety goggles, Antonio told himself, "To heck with it," and started the blowtorch. He brought the blue flame very close to the vault. From appearances, even Antonio with his non-existent expertise knew that this wasn't a very good quality vault. He was of the opinion that it had no business safeguarding such nice valuables. A semicircle of melted metal was 3/4 of the way on its journey to coming full circle when Antonio thought that this had to be too good to be true. Alan and Jeremy looked on, growing excited as the little blue flame was finishing up its vault-busting job. When Antonio reached the other side of the circle, a metal oval came loose and fell backwards. The vault unlatched, moving a tiny bit. Antonio opened it, revealing the goods: hugely high stacks of old cash, diamond-encrusted rings, upmarket necklaces, other jewelry so luminescent that viewing them almost mandated shades, and custom wristwatches and polished antique lighters with tiny clocks on the outside dating back to the early 30s. The latter alone was bound to sell for thousands apiece. Jeremy looked around, trying to find something to transport the goods to his car. None of the men thought to bring a sack or even a garbage bag.
That was okay,
Jeremy said in his head as he remained collected, searching the room for a reasonable, impromptu replacement. He pawed through the deceased's belongings, narrowing down what would work best. He found a sheet on Eleanor's bed that was on the thinner side. Feeling it, Jeremy determined it would work. He removed the blanket, laying it on the floor just as a picnicker would lay out a quilt for a day at the park. Alan and Antonio removed the loot from the vault, stacking the items in the middle of the bedsheet. Once all the valuables were despoiled from Eleanor, Jeremy ordered Alan to hitch the blanket up and sling it over his shoulder. He obeyed, resembling a thieving Santa Claus as he walked out of the room. Jeremy turned to Antonio, who was deeply disturbed by his relative's death. Not enough to repent or turn himself into the authorities, but just enough to give his stomach an extremely evident episode of queasiness. His apparent animal-loving symphony was turned off now that he was contending the feline had evidence the cops could use against them. Once Antonio had slain the cat, he was to wrap it up in a blanket or towel or whatever was readily available and bring its body down. They would be waiting for him outside, but Jeremy reminded him that they couldn't wait for very long. Jeremy assumed that one of the neighbors heard the gunshot or a bystander saw the broken door ajar and called the police. Antonio did just as he was told. He went into the mostly unlit hallway and began the door on the right side, nearest the bathroom. Opening the door, he walked in and... 3. Out came Jeremy running down the stairs and through the shower door as though hell were on his heels. Alan was standing outside Jeremy's car, leaning against the roof with their spoils sitting next to him, all wrapped up in the deceased's favorite blanket. Jeremy was ceaselessly signaling him to grab their plunder. As Jeremy got to the car, he opened the driver's door. An old car like this couldn't be opened at the push of a button, so he had to lean over the passenger's seat to unlock the door. The moment he did, Alan seized the valuables and sat, taking them on his lap as he slammed the door shut. When Alan was settled, he looked around, seeing Antonio nowhere. When he asked Jeremy what happened to Antonio, Jeremy informed him that they had to leave him behind.
He was too slow,
Jeremy asserted. His lethargy was more of a liability than an asset at this point. Alan agreed since he still didn't see Antonio. Commenting how the share would now be 50-50, Alan laughed as Jeremy smiled back at him.
Oh no, not at all,
Jeremy corrected, bringing the muzzle of his gun to Alan's temple. There was not a hint of hesitation in Jeremy's voice or action. He pulled the trigger, sending Alan's brain scattering much the same way that he sent poor Eleanor's on their final trip. A series of fast-moving sirens echoed up the street. Jeremy looked out his window to see red and blue lights oncoming. Pulling out of his parking space, Jeremy did a U-turn and peeled out into the street. He slammed on the gas pedal, sending the old car speeding on its merry way. His rust bucket on wheels made it to the end of the street, turning right just as 2 police vehicles arrived. Police lights flashed wildly as 2 officers got out of their respective cruisers. With guns drawn, one of them pointed out the damaged door, while the other leaned into their radio, requesting backup. One officer opened the door gently to see that all the lights downstairs were on and the lights upstairs were off. He instructed the other officer to check downstairs while he searched upstairs. Running up the stairs like he was in hot pursuit, and for all he knew he was, the officer felt for a light switch. Before he found it, he noticed that the light was leaking out into the dark hallway from the last room on the left. He found a switch near the top of the staircase. Flipping it up, light engulfed the corridor, allowing the officer to see what he was doing. He rushed to the agape door, kicking it open with his revolver ready. A scene of bloody walls and a still rocking chair met him. There was a painting in the corner that had blood on it too. A vault was in the middle of the wall, and a oblong circle melted into it. Most gruesome of all was poor Eleanor, slumped down in her rocking chair. Her gaunt arms hung over the armrests, her bony fingers hanging lifelessly against death and gravity. Eleanor's head was rolled to her right shoulder, with her forehead wound resembling a gaping eye socket with its eyeball scooped out. Her eyes were wide open, as unblinking as they were unresponsive. Though the officer knew that his effort would be patently for naught, he still applied 2 fingers to Eleanor's throat in pursuit of a pulse. When he found none, he called for his partner's assistance. She heard his voice echoing throughout the hall, rushing upstairs to assist him. As the 2 cops found Eleanor, Jeremy listed off places to ditch Alan's body post-haste. 4. Antonio had turned the lights on in the room directly across from Eleanor's room. As she lay dead, Antonio did what Jeremy required and looked for marmalade. He didn't know what kind of evidence a mangy cat could leave behind, but he figured he had better just ice the cat and catch up to the others. Jeremy had told him that they couldn't wait long. Antonio didn't blame him, especially with the cops probably already on their way. Furbished with a bed, mirror, and dresser, the room looked to be a guest room, or maybe it was one of her children's childhood bedrooms. Antonio didn't know and cared less. He just wanted to find the cat who was perhaps the most intelligent living thing in this whole sordid cast of characters to have fled at the sight of danger. Marmalade wasn't sitting atop the dresser, on the bed, across the windowsill, or anywhere on the floor within sight. Antonio bent down at the edge of the bed. Some musty but very elegant sheets were hanging over each side of the bed. When he lifted the hanging sheets out of his way, he only took in some darkness before feeling a sharp, razoring bolt of pain in his backside. He had never put his back out, but he imagined that was how it felt. Maybe he had done so somehow when bending down. A damp sensation pulled at the bottom of his legs. It felt odd, disturbing and wet, like diving into a shallow puddle knees first. Antonio went to go check it out, his eyesight not quite capturing the whole picture before he was distracted. A bellyache meaning a hiss was what he heard. The sound had originated from under the bed. He peered into the other corner. It was dark under the bed, but the room's light still made it seeable from where he knelt. Back in the corner, up against a rolled-up square quilt, was Marmalade. He hissed again, nearly shrieking, he was so enraged. Antonio made an attempt to seize that fur ball, full of supposedly incriminating evidence, failing beautifully. Marmalade dashed out from the other side of the bed, taking off from under the hanging blanket edges and darting out of the room. Antonio turned too late, wondering where Marmalade was as he scratched his perplexed pate. Just as he was about to leave the room, he saw the hallway lights turn on, followed by the hurried footsteps of two people running. Antonio saw that they were police officers. He immediately shut the lights off, slowly pulling the door closed. His breathing became labored as he stood against the wall in absolute darkness. Them discovering him weighed heavily on his mind, but he had an idea. Maybe he could hide out for a bit. When the officers eventually went downstairs to wait for their backup to show up and assist them, Antonio would take the opportunity to run down the stairs and slip out the back door. Of course, his plan hinged on the minor detail of the brownstone having a back door. Mumbling could be heard from across the hall. Antonio assumed the cops were talking to each other, possibly calling for backup. As he stood up against the wall, he contemplated crawling under the bed. Investigators would undoubtedly be looking there at first, he assumed, but by the time that they get around to it, he would be long gone. It sounded like the ideal hiding place, given that it was on such short notice. Antonio eyed the bedroom, taking rough, naked-eye measurements of the space under the bed. He misjudged that he would be unable to squeeze himself down there and fit, so he remained standing against the wall. More muffled sounds came from Eleanor's room. Even if Antonio couldn't understand anything they were saying, he still had to admit that these walls were as thin as thread. Police sirens could be heard bellowing in the distance. A string of taps could be heard filling the hallway. Antonio could distinguish those noises from the others without a problem. He figured that this was his most suspicious time to escape. When the sounds died down, Antonio took out of the room. The lights disoriented him momentarily before his eyes adjusted. He sprinted down the stairs. Before he could even make it halfway down, 3 police officers were heading up to Eleanor's room, one originally at the scene, and 2 new arrivals. Antonio froze, immobilized. He knew he was in for it now, yet the officers didn't seem to notice him, nor acknowledge his being there. They all went right past him, one officer bringing the other 2 up to speed on the situation. Antonio turned his head, looking around puzzled. He thought that he was dreaming, that he'd wake up at any moment. Not that he was complaining, especially if it meant that he could get off scot-free, but he still had to know why they passed him. He went back upstairs and crept up to Eleanor's room, avoiding any unnecessary noise-making in the event that it turned out that the officers could actually see him. Antonio peeked from behind the half-open door, observing as the cops all had their focus on Eleanor. There were 3 officers at the crime scene, hands all gloved and inspecting the room. But one of the officers was a female, certainly not much bigger than the male cop that had run up the stairs past Antonio. Then a voice came hollering from another room. To Antonio, it sounded like it was coming from the bedroom that he had just exited. All 3 officers drew their weapons, hustling out of Eleanor's room. Antonio knew for sure that they would spot him this time. He was erroneous in that regard. They simply trotted past him, heading for the room with no closet. Guessing by now that they would never see him, no matter what he did, Antonio took a peek from behind the scenes. A fold of blanket was pulled from where it had hung a few inches above the floor. The female officer pointed at something under the bed. She and her colleagues witnessed something they had seen many times in their line of duty, but Antonio hadn't. He had never. It was his first time looking at a dead body. The corpse looked lifeless, frozen, familiar. Almost as though Antonio was gazing into a mirror. It was his body. He was the one who was dead. Atop the bed sat Marmalade, leering at Antonio as though he was waiting for him.